So within the collections development team at Wellcome Collection, we're quite a small team. We've got 4 staff members, 2 archivists and 2 librarians, one of which manages the team. So we wanted to focus our efforts on our particular skill sets and make sure that we were doing this in the most focused way possible. So one of the strands we've been looking at is Wellcome itself. One of the archivists in the team focuses on our internal collecting and the Wellcome's corporate archive. And within this includes thinking in terms of COVID, in terms of staff experiences, organisational impact and the internal response of Wellcome. So things like the move to working from home and other policy changes that have had an impact on staff. And also thinking about external responses. So thinking about Wellcome in the media, Wellcome's involvement in vaccines and so on. This slide here is just an example of how we've been collecting staff experiences internally, which we've just done using a Microsoft form. And we've been aware that there's going to be a huge overlap between people's experiences as a worker at Wellcome and also their experiences as an individual living through this. So we've just asked people to sort of think about what they might want to have captured within the archive and taking quite a broad view on that. So here's some examples of some of the materials that are within that institutional collection. So you can see a zine that's been made by a colleague about their experiences of working from home and social distancing. And on the left-hand side, there's just a shot of our staff intranet there, which we're collecting through nothing more fancy really than using screen grab sort of functionalities via Chrome extensions. Another strand to our work is focusing on printed and published materials, and this is led by my colleague Lucia, who is a librarian. Our focus for printed and published has really been to sort of start off thinking about materials that are more ephemeral and less likely to last, and that those should be the priority. We already have a large zine collection and background in taking in materials relating to graphic medicine. So we wanted to build on that. And this slide shows a few examples of some of the materials that we have acquired. In terms of physically acquiring stuff, we've actually just had these materials sent to people's homes. And you can see here we've got a selection of greetings cards, which we thought were really interesting for capturing the the humour and satire that's often used for people celebrating miserable birthdays during lockdown, for example. And also zines, quarantines, which might be my favourite word at the moment, and books for children, which is another area that we're particularly interested in collecting at the moment, thinking about how health is communicated to younger people. Most recently, we've been looking at artistic commissions. We have commissioned 3 artists as part of 3 artists, which we did the commissioning as part of marking our reopening in October. Of course, now we're closing, but you know, that's how it is. So we commissioned 3 artists to respond to the government's COVID-19 campaign, Stay at Home, Protect the NHS, Save Lives. We're also capturing context around those commissions, and the reason these artists were chosen, it was through a closed process, was to ensure the diversity of perspective in the collections. In addition to that, sort of the work that I've focused on primarily is thinking about archives of organisations who we already work with. So that might be organisations whose work has been impacted by the pandemic in some way, or whose work has been diverted by the pandemic, and thinking about our building stronger relationships with those organisations to ensure the records they're creating at the moment, whether that's, say, for example, the National Childbirth Trust and the impact of COVID on maternity care, or Mind and the work that they've done around lockdown and mental health, that those records that they're creating now are being created and saved in a way that mean that we'll be able to take them in the future. So that's probably the least glamorous bit to the work. But yeah, important just to make sure that that records management stuff is done properly. And also just providing advice and support. So we've developed a sort of DIY guide to archiving for community groups, and thought about how we work with others, particularly through establishing the collecting network for COVID-19. And also a lot of our work has been about not acquiring materials, but instead thinking about where the most appropriate place is for things and referring people on to more relevant repositories. And that's really important to what we're trying to do with this as well, that we don't want to be out trying to grab everything we can, but very much thinking about this within an ethical framework. So I think that's everything I had to say, but it might have just been a bit of a quick ramble through, but I will stop there anyway.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. That was really interesting. We won't ask questions immediately after each speaker presents because we're a bit short on time. So if you do have any thoughts, then do drop them in the chat, and we'll go straight over to my colleagues at the Museum of London. So Foteini and Dom. Foteini, are you starting us off?
Yes, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Yvette, for organizing this. We're going to do the presentation together with my colleague Dom. So I'm going to do the first half, and then he will continue with the second half. So I'm going to give you an overview of how the collecting project started, what we have done so far, and what we're planning to do in the future. So the main aim of this project is to acquire objects that will help us to talk about the different experiences of life in London during the pandemic of 2020. From the very beginning, we outlined three main themes of collecting, which we more or less adhere to, but we very soon realized that they overlap as well. So we were interested in the effect on the physical environment, but also how many people and organizations have moved activities online, the experience of key and essential workers, as well as home life, and the effects on young people and children. Our aims soon emerged. We wanted to focus on objects that had already been made rather than asking Londoners to make something specifically for us to collect. And we were hoping to collect different types of objects that we hadn't done before, and to stretch a little bit our curatorial thinking around what an object is. The project had also a secondary aim to devise and to try out methods for rapid response collecting. We have done in the past rapid response collecting projects. Actually, our first rapid response collecting project was during World War I, and our most recent were during the Occupy London movement and the Olympics. But some of our procedures do not lend themselves to doing things quickly, and sometimes we had to coordinate the effort, change processes, sometimes challenge them in order to make things happen. So in the table, you can see the three different phases of the project. So the first one has already passed. It ended in June. So it was the first kind of like active rapid response collecting phase. We're at the moment in what we call retrospective collecting. So we're looking back, we're filling the gaps, and we continue our acquisition process. And then in the new year, we're going to focus on the legacy of the project. It's worth mentioning that we're collecting in three different ways. So we kind of we started work from home in the end of March. We devised the collecting project in the beginning of April, and we launched the public call out in the end of April, where basically we invited Londoners to share with us objects and stories that they created or helped them cope during the pandemic. We collect through internal curatorial proposals, so a more straightforward curatorial approach where curators identify what we should be adding to this collection. And we also collect through engagement and partnerships, something that John will talk about in detail after. So this is just to give you an idea of how many departments and how many colleagues we had to rope in to make this project happen. So our team leader is Beatrice Billen. She's our senior curator of fashion and decorative art. She's leading on the project, and me and Dom are part as well of this core project team. And these are different colleagues in different departments that are part of the wider collecting process. I will give you a brief overview of what we have collected so far. So from actually the beginning of the lockdown, we wanted to document this boost of posters that emerged in the city in the beginning of the pandemic. And we wanted to collect examples, including this poster about immigrants by Greg Oldman, May They Never Be Deemed Low-Skilled Again, but also posters that were created by, not only by designers and famous artists, but also by everyday people that wanted to convey a sense of like solidarity and the guidance by the government. One of the very first projects as well was we wanted to document deserted London, so photographs and recorded soundscapes of the city and how it sounded during the first lockdown. We're very interested in collecting dreams. So sleep patterns have changed during the pandemic. Our sleep, our dreams have been affected. So we're looking into creating a collection of dreams. And another thing that emerged as well was social media collecting. So not only because of the isolation and having to stay home all the time, like communication and social media was accelerated, but also we wanted to document which tweets that were posted by Londoners went viral in terms of what were the issues and the thoughts and the things that troubled Londoners at the time. We approached companies and organizations that were selling merchandise for charity, such as Origin Sounds, local DJs who raised money for food deliveries to key workers with these scarves and hats and stickers. We also acquired objects like this hand sanitizer, which was made by a London gin distillery. And our fashion curators worked with the South London Scrub Hub to acquire examples of their work, as well as testimonies and oral histories of the volunteer makers. Our social history curators are in the process of acquiring these sets of hearts that were made by volunteers for hospitals, where they're given to people who lost loved ones. We're actually acquiring these signs from Morrison supermarkets relating to domestic abuse during the lockdown. And we're also collecting a brass bookmark in the form of a hug made by social enterprise working with homeless people in North London. I'm sure that you're all aware that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected BAME individuals and communities. And we are working with our BAME staff network and external partners to document this impact. So we have partnered up with Jubilee Initiative, who launched the campaign We Need Answers. And the initiative was to gather signature to a letter sent to Boris Johnson calling for a public inquiry. And we have collected this letter in our collection. We're also working with Yellow Earth, a Pan-Asian theatre company, to help us identify objects relating to the abuse of the Chinese community in London. But we don't just want to record the hardship, we also want to celebrate contributions of individuals from ethnic minorities. It is maybe a small thing, but for now we have acquired the 3 issues of the July issue of British Vogue, which celebrated key workers, and I think it's the first time that key workers are on the cover of Vogue magazine. Our photography curator is in the process of making selections. We're collecting photographs not only from the public call out, but she's working with photographers to document the city and the experiences during the lockdown, like this amazing series of photographs by Spencer Murphy. And not entirely related to COVID, but soon after the death of George Floyd, it was very clear that we would document the Black Lives Matter protest as part of our Collecting COVID project. So we have acquired the I Can't Breathe poster, among other things, as well as the Arsenal Black Lives Matter shirt that was worn by their captain, Pierre Aubameyang, after the first match after the death of George Floyd. And I'm going to finish with some examples from our public call out. So on the bottom left corner, you can see Beatrice, our project lead, who basically did an amazing call out through media, and that resulted in over 530 donations from the public that we're in the process of going through and responding to all of them. We are not going to collect all of them. We're about to collect probably 100. And this is an example of objects we have been offered. So from rattles that were made for the NHS Thursday clapping to lockdown Easter eggs. That was a big theme during Easter. And I'm gonna finish with probably one of my favorite objects. This was offered by an architecture firm, and these are the instructions of how to build a Nightingale hospital in just an A2 sheet. I'm going to mute myself now, and I'm going to pass it over.
Thank you, Foteini. Yes, hi, my name is Dom. As Foteini was saying, I was one of the content leads of the curatorial leads of the project. When I am not chasing objects and stories relating to the pandemics, I lead a project, a contemporary curating project at the Museum of London called Curating London. Which is a team of a number of curators that aims at recording contemporary city, the contemporary London. And obviously COVID being an important landmark in contemporary history of the city, the team actively contributed with a number of collecting projects, which I'm going to quickly recount. I will talk to you about 3 projects in particular and 2 others in the pipeline, because as Foteini was saying, we are entering a stage where we're looking at strengthening our acquisition proposal, but also looking at the legacy of the project. So One of the first projects that we quickly put together in collaboration with our partners was to reflect upon the fact that in 2020, Ramadan, the month of Ramadan, the only month of Ramadan, fall during lockdown. So between Thursday, the 23rd of April, and Saturday, the 23rd of May. Obviously, the social gatherings that were part of Ramadan were severely affected, if not made impossible at all by the restrictions. We decided to respond to this lack of participation into an important event for the Muslim community by setting up two community-led projects. One targeted a young Muslim and led by our youth culture curator Dilyas Nussi, and another one looking at the experience of seven Muslim families across London, also led by our community engagement manager Aisling Serran. In these two projects, in the case of the experience of young people, Dilia set up a WhatsApp group with 6 young people in West London and recorded to record their experience throughout the month. This resulted into a wealth of content, of multimedia content that Foteini is helping to unravel with her expertise on digital born content. Conversely, Aisling worked with 7 families across London who kept a diary of Ramadan and produced both digital content and suggested relevant objects for our collections, which we are in the process of acquiring. As part of the Ramadan collecting projects, we also worked in collaboration with a small mosque in East London called Musala Hanur. Hackney Council, alongside many other councils across the city, considering the restraints of lockdown, exceptionally allowed for Adhan prayers to be publicly performed. So we recorded the audios essentially of the evening prayers for the last 10 days of Ramadan up to the 23rd of May. And moving on, another project that we did was led by our curator of Curating London, Natasha Vickers, who essentially reflected upon the burgeoning of mutual aid support networks that emerged very quickly around the city to supplement areas of lack in service provision. And these are, as you all know, community-based networks that responded either to the need to provide more food and support to the elderly in the community, or to overcome the digital divide for access to services. Natasha worked tirelessly in establishing contacts during the process of lockdown, and then when the lockdown eased, she traveled around and to record oral histories following the advice of the Oral History Society that were circulated earlier in the year. As part of this project, Natasha interviewed a Filipino restaurant that in South London has been cooking meals for Filipino nurses during the pandemic. She has also talked to Project Parka, who set up a small community organization that set up a homeless shelter in Walthamstow, and several other local support networks that also, as well as provided oral history suggesting objects that reflect their experience. We also set up a collaboration with universities, and particularly UCL Museum Studies and the SMs in Science Communication at Imperial College, and in launching a project that we call Pandemic Streets, which was an attempt at running an observational study that would record how our sense of the place and access to the built environment changed as a reflection of the social distance measure. As part of this process, we collected, and we are in the process of collecting some poignant testimonies, such as the testimony of a student who moved home during the pandemic, and recalling her experience of also traveling through London in deserted streets. And also we are collecting some shoes and dress from somebody that has, for example, in a quite anticlimactic way, was lots of people start up running and pick up running during the pandemic. This person was training for the Edinburgh Marathon, but actually was too scared to go out to the streets. So she donated the shoes that she never used. These are sort of a very quick overview of the various community-led collecting projects that we have been doing so far. There are a few others in the pipeline. We are talking to Amnesty International that together with Black Pride, Para Pride, and Gender Intelligence have developed this initiative called Pride Inside to celebrate Pride for 2020, which as a parade couldn't happen. So we are currently talking to Amnesty International and our various other partners to collect several initiatives. We're also very conscious that these the COVID has obviously affected the most vulnerable segment of society, including refugees in London. So we're talking to the Refugee Support Network, who has launched this these initiatives called Connecting Through COVID, whereby members of the public were invited to send postcards and messages of good wish to unaccompanied minors. We in turn responded with some audio recording, which we are looking into collecting. I will leave it here because I'm aware that there is still another presentation, so I'll mute myself and happy to answer any question you might have.
Thank you very much, Foteini and Dom. That was really interesting presentation as well. I'm sure we're all getting lots of questions in our heads now. Don't forget to use the chat as well if you anything springs to your mind now, and pop something in there. So our next presentation is from Meg and from Joanna at the Postal Museum.
So hi everyone, I'm Meg and I'm one of the archivists at the Postal Museum, and I'm joined today by my colleague who works as a curator, Joanna. And we're going to talk about the work that we've been doing around contemporary collecting at the Postal Museum, and basically how kind of postal infrastructure has really interfaced with the pandemic and our efforts to kind of capture and document that within our many collections. So very quickly, just about us as a museum. We're an independent museum, but we do hold the organisational archives of both Post Office Limited and Royal Mail Group, as well as our independent museum and philatelic collections. And we say we're normally home to about 500 years of postal history. We're also a very small organisation, and that's going to become important in a while when we talk about the impact of furlough and how that had on the project that we've been doing. So this is actually comes from the Royal Mail website, and this is what I saw quite early on in the pandemic, and this really got the kind of cogs turning in my mind around this idea of the postal service as being incredibly important, which it is, but I think it's one of those things normally that's one of those invisible infrastructures that you don't necessarily think about it that much until you have to deal with it or something goes wrong, and all of a sudden, for at least a segment of the population, we went from being out a lot and being able to buy things when we were out to being basically stuck at home and relying on postal and delivery networks to get everything, you know, and that's kind of your normal day-to-day poster, you know, huge deliveries of toilet paper, which I definitely took in during this time, and as well as the way that Royal Mail has supported and reinforced government messaging during this time. So Joe, do you want to take over and say how we started to kind of capture some of this within the team?
Yes, so I just introduced myself. My name's Joanna and I'm curator at the Postal Museum, and been quite blown away by the sheer amount of things people have been able to accomplish during the pandemic. Amazing. And it's probably, as Meg said, really important to just express that we're a very small team. And right at the beginning of lockdown, when the furlough scheme became available, the vast majority of our collections team and also the wider organisation was furloughed. I think at the maximum, around 95% of the organisation was furloughed. So by and large, it's been Meg and I working on the contemporary collecting project. So we first of all tackled it by right back in March, when things were changing really quickly in terms of our own organisation, but also nationally and internationally. And then in terms of how people were using the post, lots of stories were emerging really quickly related to the pandemic and the post. And we haven't really collected in this way before. So the first thing we did was just start to track and pool stories which were relevant to the Postal Museum, and try and identify themes, and then try to start thinking about what sort of objects that might be that we would collect either immediately or in the medium term or in the much, much longer term. So this slide here is just a little screenshot of the Excel document that we created. It's quite basic, but entirely what we did was, if we saw a theme coming up, for example, thumbs up for posties, we'd put that in the spreadsheet. We'd link it to the types of objects we'd seen related to that theme. We'd note down when we saw that theme emerging. And it's been really useful to have this as a resource to see the progression, the development of stories, and what seemed like a really big story at the time, maybe that petered out into nothing. Things which you thought might be a bit of a flash in the pan, they might have a longer term significance. So it's been quite helpful. We also expanded this out, not just to the collections team who were not on furlough, but to the whole remaining organisation. And that was a step we took because we were really keen for this collecting project to be at the heart of the organisation as it stood during that furlough scheme and during all this change. And also we, before the pandemic, wanted to find ways for the wider organisation to feel empowered about the collection. And often I think it's a problem that the collection is separate to the work of other teams in organisations. So we wanted everybody across the organisation to feel really empowered to say, oh, hey, have you spotted this story that's connected to the post? And to feel they knew how we were operating and demystify some of the processes as well.
And give people also a frame, just following on from that, giving people a frame and kind of a framework to be able to feel that they were empowered to do this kind of work. I think we wanted to demystify collecting as much as possible for people, and actually giving them some kind of themes to grapple with was really useful in having people add things, especially things that we hadn't seen. I think that we very quickly saw that we read the same newspapers. So to actually make sure that we were capturing a broader segment of the different stories that were out there. It's quite interesting. I was looking through this the other day and I've noticed that so many of the articles are from the first half of the year. And it's very interesting to see how, although there actually are a few more now coming up, and it's really interesting to think about the temporal aspects of the pandemic, I suppose, in terms of collecting, that was this kind of very much focus at the start on news and you felt like you were almost being battered by everything, but actually it's become much slower now and we've been able to get a bit of hindsight on some of these things. But I think it was really good at the time for us to do this because, you know, we didn't know what would be important necessarily. We, like Joanna said, we didn't know whether things would be a flash in the pan or if we would, you know, if it actually would be a very, very interesting story for us to continue to develop. And these are, I mean, this, we've got probably about 50 themes in total now, and this is just an example of some of the ones. So Jo, did you want to talk about some of these?
Yeah, sure. So there's a real range of stories connected to the pandemic and the post, and they range from quite light touch stories about postal workers in fancy dress entertaining the public, to really traumatic stories about key workers, as postal workers are key workers, working through a really traumatic national, international emergency, and anxieties around receiving the post. So we're aware people are quarantined their mail, and how do we translate that into a story which we can capture in the historical record? National messaging. Boris Johnson sent a letter out across the nation, which was a really significant moment for the Post. Other stories such as Thumbs Up for Posties campaign. So what we kind of became aware of was that there was a really positive story which was being told around heroes, key workers as heroes, and we were kind of aware that we didn't want to solely focus on that, but we wanted to understand and record in more detail the flattening nature of being called a hero, and also how do we capture and record the real anxieties postal workers and end users have experienced around the post and the pandemic. And I think that's why we decided to construct a strategy which would have a phased approach to collecting. 3 phases which were built around when would it be appropriate to collect different types of material, primarily focused on the ethics, but also the likelihood of certain types of objects being destroyed. And the phases would be something we could accomplish then and there during the pandemic, as I said, with just really Meg and I working with not much resource behind it. And then as time goes on, when we have more resources in the organisation, and also when some of the people involved in these stories have some distance from them, when we can start to collect traumatic stories in a really sensitive and considered manner.
Yeah, and I think that point about time again, and that has come up a couple times today, is really an interesting one, because there was this thought, and so much of this material was ephemeral, especially kind of the more positive celebratory material was quite ephemeral. So there was this worry that we would lose it if we didn't capture it somehow. But at the same time, I'm really glad that we were able to internally kind of push back on some of the expectations that were being brought on us. So there was a suggestion very early on from a member of our executive team that we start doing oral histories. And we very politely said that was not a good idea for so many reasons, but primarily because this is a huge traumatic event in people's lives, and we want to give them time to process that, as opposed to thinking that they owed us their trauma. And that's also that idea of being very trauma focused has approach to how we're doing our internal collecting. So we're very aware that we want stuff internal from our for our depositing organisation, but we know that they also have a lot on at the moment, and we don't want to be adding noise to their lives in a way that isn't actually helpful, especially if this is some stuff that we can wait for. So Joanna and I have very many conversations just exactly like this, where we're kind of working out these problems, because they're knotty problems that we necessarily didn't before have to consider in a lot of our work. You wouldn't necessarily think that postal workers go through a lot of trauma, but this has been an incredibly taxing period for them. We were talking yesterday when we were preparing this presentation, and we were saying that how even every one of these examples here on the slide all these stories have so many different meanings attached to them. So the latest one that is on here is about Royal Mail's hiring of Christmas temps. So, 33,000 extra workers sounds a lot, but it's not really, given that they're dealing with postal volumes since March of this year that have been 30% higher. So how do you manage to capture that nuance of actually, what does this mean for workers? And, and we really want to have workers' voices within our collections, because otherwise we just become a very nice and expensive PR machinery. We're not actually grappling with the real knotty nature of some of these problems. So always keeping in mind at all times that to do some of this ethically, we have to do it slowly. And I've actually recently read an article by Kimberly Kristen and Jane Anderson, which is called Slow Archives, which I found very kind of meaningful and kind of putting words to some of the thoughts that we were feeling about actually how slowing down is about acting ethically in a lot of these situations, that there can be too much of a rush, especially to acquire, and that doesn't really consider all of the different relationships that exist within collecting practices. So Jo, do you want to talk about our external collecting?
Yes, so some of the things we have achieved, and we have put messages out around, were around the first phase of collecting, which were identified as being objects which might be lost or destroyed, and also ethically, which we judge to be not stepping into that traumatic realm, both for our own members of staff and also the people we'd be collecting from. So we launched a collecting project over the summer, which was focused around letters, envelopes, greetings cards, and also parcels and packaging. And we worked on that with our marketing team because we undertook that collecting by a public call out. And off the back of that, we had around 40 responses, ranging from things that people received through the post, like artworks that grandparents received from their grandchildren, lots of cases of people who were feeling isolated, sort of reigniting old friendships through the post. We had one young woman who had fake tan sent to her through the mail as a matter of some urgency. It was a really interesting example of the types of mail that people have been receiving. And we intentionally couched that quite, as I said, quite light touch, because we didn't want to demand people share their trauma with us. But actually, as it transpired, people have offered letters to us, which, for example, one lady whose final correspondence with her mother, who was in a care home. So that's obviously a really important story in terms of how you could communicate with people in care homes during the height of the pandemic. And we had been intending to ask for those objects to be sent to the museum, because we actually reopened at the end of October. So we were just gearing up to send that out to all the responders, but unfortunately we are closing our doors again tomorrow. So we're just working out what to do, really, because we're kind of aware that some of these items might get lost, or they might get thrown away, but there's nobody at the museum to receive them. So we're just working through how to manage that, really. It's a bit of a documentation quandary. And we're also relaunching that collecting project in time for lockdown 2.0. And obviously we're going to have a Christmas during the next month or so. And Christmas throws up its own interesting problems, because it's obviously a really big time for the post, but part of this project is we've wanted to be more representative, and we have actively been trying to collect greetings cards from a spectrum of religious holidays, and we haven't made much ground there. And I think that speaks to the audience that we generally have through the doors. It speaks to our social media audience as well. So we're trying to spread that message by working with our Access and Learning team, and also with our comms team, but they will all be going back on furlough. So we kind of choose one step forward, two steps back in some respects. But I think the collecting project has opened our eyes to some of the problems we were aware that we had in terms of diversity of the people we collect from, and we want to improve that, acknowledge it and improve it, and make our historical record more representative and more useful for the future.
And I think this is a really great opportunity to be a bit more reflexive and reflective of the kind of work that we do, because I think that we had ambitions around improving the diversity of people that we collect from, but we didn't really have a clear idea of how we would do that. So now that we have an evidence base that we can say that we're not very diverse, we can actually go from there, whereas before we were kind of just speculating.
I should add, sorry, we've been collecting protected characteristic information from people at the point of offering an object to us, so that we can, as Meg said, anecdotally, we've been aware that we aren't diverse with the voices within the collection, but now we can at least say statistically we have these voices within the collection, and we can use that as a way to improve and do better.
Thank you.
Yeah, because we haven't been in the museum at all, we've not been able to collect, to see anything from kind of public donations. But here are some things that I've collected. I like to see that this issue of Vogue is getting airplay now at the Museum of London as well. But for us, it's really important because it has a postal worker, and you actually don't see representations of female postal workers that often. So to actually have one displayed in this way has been fantastic. And Joanna has actually been in touch with Carrie, the postwoman pictured, and we do plan on having an oral history interview with her in the future. So that's been really fabulous, and it's a really good relationship for us to nurture. And I've also got here a shielding letter that I received, and some cards, including one, a Boris Johnson themed one that my husband was not very happy to receive, as well as a letter from his grandfather who's in a care home in Scotland. So all of these things, we necessarily wouldn't have kept some of these things in the same way before, but they have so many meanings attached to them now, and it's really getting that nuance and the context behind things that's become very important for us throughout our project so far.
Thank you so much, Joanna and Meg. That was really fantastic. Really appreciate that. And so our last speaker is Marie. Is it Tully Rose or Rose-Tulley? I keep getting it mixed up.
It's Tully Rose.
So it's Marie from the Museum of Croydon who's going to speak about the collecting across the museum and archive there. So thank you.
So obviously for us, we've got a slightly different focus in that we're a local authority museum that started in the mid-90s. So if you haven't visited us before, just a bit of background really. And we exist within the Clock Tower, which is Croydon's biggest civic space right in the heart of the town, which includes the Central Library, David Lean Cinema, our adult learning and a cafe along with the museum. We're a small team of 5 and supported by a fabulous team of volunteers. And we've gone through different iterations over our period of history to now, where we depict really the history of Croydon chronologically in our permanent galleries upstairs, whilst downstairs we exhibit the Riesco collection, Anglo-Saxon and Roman finds, along with our research room where you can access the Borough Archive collection and local history material. We also have a number of exhibition spaces, including the Atrium Exhibition Gallery and upstairs for temporary projects. So we revised from this year actually our mission statement to signify our role in Croydon, and also to show our priority in terms of how we work with communities to empower them to tell their stories. So really for us, the Museum of Croydon seeks to recognise its communities, cultures and citizens as experts in their own histories. Up to our closure in March, we'd just launched our brand new year-long exhibition programme. This was meant to be a trial and test year as we tested the mission statement, as I outlined before, by inviting 9 communities, artists and groups to stage their own exhibitions inspired by the collection, or more crucially proved we had a gap. This way of working in a more co-curatorial way is actually the foundation of the museum, with a majority of items on display in our galleries loaned and donated by members of the community when it was first formed in the 90s. These were collected by people from those communities, and each object comes with an accompanying oral history, which makes up really the core of our permanent collection. We'd begun revisiting this approach informally up to the formal exhibition programme, What's Your Croydon, which is what we called it, with artists in residence through to our Windrush exhibition where all the objects were loaned, and we provided the exhibition space through to a loan of a Stormzy portrait from the National Portrait Gallery, which had an accompanying artwork from a contemporary artist called Pins in a large scale interactive way. Our working direct with communities and artists we noticed provided the most benefit in terms of engagement and also sense of ownership from residents, which helped us formalise the exhibition programme. We were also successful in becoming Borough of Culture 2023, and all of our programming from here on in is in a way leading us up to that year, with an emphasis on our themes of system change and Croydon's cultural DNA. Like everyone else, we closed, which meant a complete overnight overhaul of our offer. Up to this point, we relied heavily on the physical space to now having to go virtual and working remotely. Our exhibition programme, of which we were just about to launch our first late event, was cancelled. We as a team had to work from home and get into grips, obviously, with MS Teams and Zoom, not being able to work with our residents face to face, amongst all the other challenges we all collectively experienced. We were really concerned that a museum about a specific place couldn't translate as a virtual offer, particularly with the significant influx of museum digital content at the time. But the impact of schemes such as Museum Passion and also what we coined the country file effect has actually led to an uptick of online engagement and inquiries. These figures amazingly go over and above the physical numbers of visitors in the last year multiple times over, and it's actually been really overwhelming for us to manage this kind of digital responsibility. However, this is against a backdrop of huge societal changes. Black Lives Matter led us to understand even more our position of responsibility in working with communities in recognising the structural racial inequalities which underpin society, which must be addressed. And protests such as We Make Events highlighted the fragility of the cultural sector and the arts in particular, which has been severely impacted by COVID and has also had a fundamental impact in Croydon. Leading on from this, it was clear we needed to keep engaging with our communities and visitors, and that there was a real desire from them to do so. Our museum, as mentioned, stems from a community collecting focus, so transcribing this online was challenging, but also an opportunity for just to try new things. I would like to say we had a strategy to begin with, but like our exhibition programme, it was formed by a more trial and test mindset, because so much of our work in reinforcing our mission statement and testing it is about experimentation and working with communities who determine our programming for us and identify the value we can deliver for them by giving them the agency to do so. Our formal museum collecting effectively stops in 2011, but we know so much of Croydon's history has taken place since then. And now with COVID as the biggest event in our modern history, we knew we needed to start collecting again in earnest, but with communities at the heart of this, even if we had to do that virtually. This was also a crucial opportunity to look at our collections development policies, which haven't been updated since 2011, and an emphasis on providing benefit and value to residents as our main motivation. We started with our letters from lockdown, where anyone could send in text, image, sound, or film in relation to their experience during the first lockdown. We also created a storytelling activity page based on one of our exhibitions, and finally currently offer remote volunteering through the transcription of our oral history collection, which has actually allowed us to engage with volunteers beyond Croydon. This in turn has brought new stories to light for us and also demonstrated how much of our collection connected with audiences. As mentioned before, our exhibition programme was designed around communities and artists staging their own exhibitions, which we were also able to move online thanks to those guys being so willing to adapt in this way. The 3 exhibitions took on different approaches from the physical to the virtual, with Croydon Natural History Scientific Society creating an online gallery of their 19th century photography, Good Wolf, who explored the history of Croydon's authors and storytellers with online family interactive activities, and finally Play for Progress, whose exhibition created by unaccompanied minor refugees and asylum seekers became an online set of music and art classes to tap into the healing power of creative arts, of which anyone could participate during lockdown. We feel this way of working is much more authentic and ensures the most relevance for our audiences, as these are groups or artists who work at a grassroots level, whilst also giving them opportunities and a platform to promote their work. We removed our bias from the process by having a community group also part of the selection process of the exhibitions. And by translating these online, we've actually been able to broaden our audiences further and also significantly reduce the barriers to access, which is a big challenge for us in our physical space. Ultimately, we realised, although that these are Croydon based in terms of the themes, but actually these do come across in a universal way, because collectively it's about the human experience. And we took an opportunity in sort of representing that by rebranding the exhibition programme to What's Our Croydon, to reflect that inclusivity and also recognise the incredibly strong sense of community that came together during COVID. So this led us to working in a way online, which is more about facilitation and giving space to others digitally, in the same way that we were delivering our What's Your Croydon programme, as we were approached by different groups and artists during lockdown who wanted to work with us. We wanted to help local organisations and artists wherever we could, and the focus on how we can give the most value and benefit was by us providing a platform and space to showcase their projects. This shift meant not only a change in how we approach collecting and curation, but also us getting to grips with collecting born digital objects, which we haven't been able to do previously. Examples included Colour Croydon, which is a partnership with local artists called Scene in Croydon, who came up with a colouring in an activity they promoted online during the start of the previous lockdown to promote wellbeing and calmness. We created an online gallery linked to Instagram and showcased selected entries with the prize for the best one. We have teamed up with Multi from Apsara Arts, who is one of the artistic programmers for Mela, who is leading on My Home is My Island, where she is conducting socially distanced interviews with members of the community, specifically in relation to the female South Asian community, to understand their experience of lockdown. These will be showcased as videos in an online gallery with accompanying blogs to give further details in the next couple of weeks. We've collaborated with C3 for their coronavirus time capsules with Croydon Music and Art, which is a number of films created by young people detailing firsthand what lockdown has been like for young people, where their school life and social life has been so radically changed. These give intimate snapshots from a firsthand experience of lockdown in Croydon, and without a partnership such as CMA, we would not have a relationship with these young people, so we wouldn't be able to collect these types of stories and had an opportunity really to understand their perspectives. We also noticed a big change in our archive inquiries, where previously they tended to be quite specific or researcher-led, to an increasing generalist interest, where it's quite clear people were spending more time looking to the history of their home or family history at this natural point of reflection. This has led us to look at how we provide information in the Cane Hill Hospital records, for instance, which have been highlighted in the recent Who Do You Think You Are episode with David Williams. We are looking at to develop better tools online to allow for people to have that space for self-research and exploration. And finally, we're working with Shanika Benjamin, who's just been launched as Croydon's first Poet Laureate on a Diversity Matters grant supported by the MDO, where she'll work with young people to look into the representation of BAME voices in our collection and highlight any gaps that we have. As I said, our collection stops in 2011. So for young people, that period of, we've lost a huge period of time that really resonates with them in terms of the history. And we're going to get them to work with us to create new labels and artistic interpretive responses to our collections to highlight the significance and relevance of BAME voices in our collection. I just wanted to highlight this project actually as a sort of amalgamation of all our approaches to community-led collecting in a digital format during this time. So the Queer Plus Croydon project was led by a Croydon contemporary artist called Mark Goldby, who sought to establish a queer archive in Croydon and was meant to be actually our next physical exhibition. And obviously he chose to go online so that we could continue to deliver it, because this was meant to be part of our Pride programming, which unfortunately got cancelled. But we felt it was still a really crucial time for us to highlight the queer community during COVID. The project consisted of an online exhibition written by Mark of his experiences in looking at the history of queer objects in our collection, which he released through chapters. We sort of experimented by releasing things on a weekly basis, as well as an active digital collecting project and a newly commissioned artwork, which will be released by Mark for LGBT History Month in February. This sort of multifaceted approach we've taken to collecting during this time as a form of participant and engagement also for us highlighted the impact of us acting as a co-curator and providing space for artists whose lived experience is essential to the relevance and authenticity of voice in presenting the lives and perspectives of others. In relation to discussion around ethics and in the context of collecting during this time, for us, that is informed by working with artists and communities in that way. And then I wanted to just end here in saying a huge thank you to the team, because it's been, for everyone else, it's been a huge, massive challenge and a change for us and the artists and community groups for allowing us to go digital in this way. I think we've created some really interesting work as a response, and actually it's for us, it's changed our approach to how we work with the residents authentically and through direct participation and conversation. And I just wanted to, if I've got time, I thought I'd show you one of the coronavirus time capsule videos. It's only like a minute and a half.
Hello, it's the 1st of April. This is a time capsule.
It's a record of who we are right now and a record of when the coronavirus came out.
When all the schools shut down.
And everyone was told to stay inside.
We're a group of teenagers
sitting in our
bathroom,
in our living rooms,
in our kitchens, our balconies,
in our gardens.
In a place called Croydon, stuck in our houses.
In Southeast London.
In England. In Europe.
The world.
For the next few weeks or months. No one knows how long, really. We're not going anywhere, so we're going to film ourselves every week.
So we remember what it was like.
What we did.
And what we didn't do.
How we felt.
Because this has never happened before, and it might never happen again.
Our time capsule starts
now.
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 Thank you very much, Marie. I was quite interested. Elena mentioned, you know, and in fact, quite a few of the speakers mentioned the sensitivities around the COVID issue, and it sounds as though you've all thought about, given that a great deal of thought, and you've handled that all very well. My question in a way is really, you know, first of all, do you have any sort of tips for how to go about handling those things, not only for the people that you are collecting from and that you are involved with, but also for yourselves? Because I imagine that you've come across some quite difficult situations, or may well do as the projects progress, and I'm just wondering how you're planning to how you've handled it so far, and how you're planning to handle those things. So I don't know if anybody would like to respond to that.
May I make a start? Is that all right? So what's been quite interesting is, and really, really beneficial, is the way the whole sector has really been very supportive. So we've had discussions with people in other organisations, and it's been a really, really great opportunity to meet my colleagues in other organisations. And I hope that's not an isolated thing. I really hope we can continue that in the future and carry on learning and talking to each other, because I think it has been one of the most beneficial things. And often, if in those discussions, as has happened a few times, something's been thrown up, a particularly traumatic area of collecting, for example, it's often, if I'm working in just this room by myself, it can feel a little bit difficult to work out how to digest it. And obviously it's important to emphasize that the people in our organizations dealing with these issues are living through a pandemic, so it's difficult, you know, you don't know what's going on in individuals' lives. So by and large, I'll just send a quick call through to Meg and just say, Meg, have you got 5 minutes? And we'll just talk it out, basically. And often with ethical considerations, there's sometimes not a right or a wrong answer. It's just a case of working out the best thing you can do. And I think if you come at these issues from a place of respect and consideration, and by the main thing we keep on saying is we don't want to do anyone any harm. And I think the temptation to be a bit grabby and say, I want this, it just has to be measured and tempered all the time by saying we don't want to do any harm. And that's the main thing it boils down to for me, really.
Is there anything from any of the other speakers to add to that, or from the speakers first and then from anyone else, if you've got any thoughts on that? Just to kind of echo and say that to really guard against that impulse, I would say, to think like, oh God, we have to get things now. Yeah. Because, you know, I think I always keep in my mind that archives especially are never complete. There's always stuff that's missing. So there is no reason why, I mean, we want to cover as many different dynamics as possible, but we can't cover everything, and actually some stuff will be lost, and that's fine. And not to put that pressure both on other people and ourselves to do this, because, you know, we're also working in very difficult circumstances, and some of us are working in organizations where there is just not a lot of support at the moment. You know, like Joanna said, most of our colleagues were furloughed, so actually we were doing much more, you know, stuff that we wouldn't normally do. And with you, Marie, God, people and their inquiries over this past couple, you know, and so actually, you know, we have to divert our attention elsewhere, and that's fine, and not to have too much of a sense of guilt over that we're letting people down, because there will always be something. You know, historians have always managed to write about the Dark Ages, and, you know, by their very nature, the Dark Ages, it's not like loads survived. So I think a sense of perspective is what I'm getting at around that. Like, don't, yeah, you know, just be really conscious that you can't get everything, and actually sometimes, like, you know, it's, you know, it wasn't meant for you anyway, so that's fine.
Great. Yeah, I would really agree with that. And I think for us, by sort of putting the collecting in the hands of the community to decide what they they valued was really important to us, because actually we got so much joy out of this period of time in collecting, just by really tapping into just how much the community meant to each other. And there was mention of mutual aid groups, and we've done some collecting of the posters from that time, and we know that will probably happen again. But things like Colour Croydon was just such a joyful experience to see people really connect in that way. And for us, by having it in the ownership of our communities, they're telling us what stories are the most value to them that they want to reflect on after. But yeah, the inquiries it's been so interesting, just seeing that nature of sort of how people are using this period of time as a self-reflection and a sort of self-identifying moment, and anything that we can do to sort of help them with that, whilst also appreciating, our resources are limited and we're a much smaller team in a way than we were, because we're just not physically present in the same way, has just been actually it's led to a lot more innovation for us than I think we could have ever realized, but also recognizing that as well at the same time. Yeah,
that's really interesting.
I'll just jump quickly, and with Foteini, we'll probably have other reflections on this. I think there are two elements here. One, which is a point of self-care that was mentioned before and relates to our own work as people that underwent through the pandemic. And I think that the Museum of London has been lucky with respect to furloughing, because none of the curatorial team has been furloughed, which explains why we were able to undertake a very sort of structured collecting project. So there is a matter of luck and privilege, I would say, in that respect. In terms of self-care, I think nobody was prepared. So how we answered to that is probably by making sure that we would check in at our weekly and more catch up with the core team, with Foteini and Beatrice, I would say. So that has been really helpful. But that, aside from that, I think there is a point about ethics and trauma that's been extensively discussed, and I think it's a fundamental part of what we've been doing. I will also highlight here, just following on what Marie was saying before, that we cannot really, and apologies, Marie, if I am misrepresenting what you're saying, but it's like that we can't really assume until we ask what people's experience are. So I think that I think it's important whilst it's important to keep an eye on ethics of practice, we cannot assume that trauma is the only experience. Resilience has been a big part of it, in fact, and I think that your projects, Marie, really a testament of it, and a number of projects that we have run also are kind of showcase the agency as opposed to the trauma. They both coexist, but I don't think that taking an overcautious approach to museum practice is necessarily sort of is the only way, essentially, because what we might do by assuming that trauma is widespread and the only experience is to essentially miss out on collecting stories and objects that relates to resilience and agency. I don't know if Foteini, is there anything that you want to add in this respect?
I don't think I have anything like more wise to add. Like I agree with everything said before. I mean, we all feel it was a hard time for those who were on furlough, but I think it was sometimes harder for those who were not on furlough, because it was like a little more overwhelming. I do feel that we, through our collecting project, we probably, try to boost and accelerate our civic role in terms of like how and what we're collecting. Of course, we're, object oriented, we're thinking of collections, but I think at least in a more, in a larger scale way, it was probably the first time that we put like the people first. So by actually asking them, what would you want us to collect? It was, giving priority to all these like collecting policies and collecting strategies. So actually asking people, what do you want us to do? How do you want us to tell this story? What do you want us to collect? It was probably a little bit of a shift in terms of, you know, how we would, you know, collect and acquire, you know, objects, you know, before that.
Thank you.
I'm happy to say on that, yes, absolutely. For us, if anything, it reinforces our relevance and value that we give as a service, because it shows that we can align much more with contemporary cultural practice in Croydon, which is something that we've been so keen to prove, because for us, Croydon's been on this crazy trajectory of arts and culture over the last few years, and I sort of highlighted the fragility of that as a result, as a risk because of COVID. And I think our contemporary collecting and our way of working has just reinforced that museums are hugely a part of that and not as separate institutions to that. So I think for us, it's just really evidence back to our organisation and being in a local authority context, just the value that we can bring during this time. Also, obviously, we do work in the context that we could be deployed to COVID at any point, because we are local authority, and that there is an expectation that we could be at any point. So as I said, for me, it's reinforced the value and the benefit we have to bring to people during this time, and it's been a really good way of doing that and demonstrating that, definitely.
Yeah, I would say for us, it's increased our visibility within the organisation in terms of the collections development work that we do, and it's really helped us to forge closer relations working with Wellcome Collection, which we're a part of, but just thinking about it in terms of like the public programming and curators side of it, we've been able to forge much closer working relationships with them, and particularly surrounding the commissioning work that we've been doing. And that's been a very new strand for us, because it's thinking not about commissioning for exhibition display, but actually commissioning pieces primarily for their use within the research collections. So that's been really important for us, and also the work that my colleague has been doing within the collections development team, thinking about the Wellcome Trust archive and staff experiences, has, I think, really opened people's eyes to what it means to have our own institutional archive, and the idea of that being about so much more than just sort of the executive board minutes, and actually much more about people's individual experiences and what they're going through at the moment. So I think that's been a really important part of sort of seeing the community of the organisation. I think as well, as part of that, we've sort of had to be quite measured at the start about what we were doing, and think about the idea of, you know, that we didn't want to do a massive call out for materials, and that we wanted to make sure we were doing things slowly. And sometimes within the organisation there can be pressure to act fast, or to be able to get a exciting press release out. And certainly in those early days we didn't have anything to sort of physically show for the work that we've been doing. A lot of these things are just conversations that are ongoing, but we sort of kept on at that message, and I think it's really helped to develop an understanding of what our team does, and that it's not just about getting in as much stuff as possible, and that we're certainly not looking to build the biggest collection by far, but that we're actually trying to think about how we can have some meaning in everything that's happening, and some relevance to those ongoing issues.
Meg?
Yeah, so we had a bit of a problem coming up with our institutional collecting, which is one of our depositing organisations, who are a public records body, approached two different museums because they had responded to shiny call outs, and they had offered material that actually, for, you know, public records reasons especially, actually should go to us, and we only found out about that because one of the organisations got in touch with us, thankfully, and then we kind of unpicked it from there. And I think that has shown me that there's been a real failure in past approaches in terms of advocacy. The fact that someone would go to another organisation where there's no existing relationship because they actually are fundamentally unaware of what we do, and so that's been a real a learning point, I think, for the team, that, you know, that obviously something went wrong here, and I think, you know, from various different perspectives, actually how can we use that now as a lever to develop that relationship? Because it's all well and good me quoting the Public Records Act at people, and believe you me, I did, but actually that's not going to help in terms of getting things in the future. And actually we want to build a more positive relationship with people. So thankfully that situation has resolved itself, but I think that that really shows that that relationship was not there to begin with, and actually that we need to be much more proactive on things like institutional collecting, because it's one thing to have, say, a retention schedule. It's quite another thing if the department in question ignores the retention schedule and then goes to one of the large national museums. So it's about actually how do you translate that from like a tool that you have into something that's meaningful for people. And there's so much of that, as Elena said, it's about building relationships. It's actually about talking to people, I think, a lot of the time. And I think that that sometimes is quite difficult, maybe outside of kind of heritage professionals, to really have that understood at kind of a senior management level, because, you know, they don't see things coming in, they just see you spending quite a lot of time having circular conversations. But I think there has been a real, I don't think I'm talking out of school when I say, like, actually there's been much more support for the kind of public facing things that we've been doing, because they are nice and shiny and glossy and we can point to them, as opposed to some of the really hard work that it actually takes to develop institutional relationships, because that stuff takes time and it's not instant. And it just does require like a lot of perseverance and patience. But actually the dividends that can pay off is so much more worthwhile, because then, you know, we're actually going to get, you know, as opposed to kind of getting a couple things, you know, like a couple odd things from marketing, we're actually going to get the real meat of stuff that's actually going to give context and nuance to those finished products.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question, more than anything, because people assume that that's what museums do, particularly if you start working with them and you do a call out. We got a lot of those inquiries. Yes, we're suggesting this object. When is the exhibition? I think that's, and that's a kind of a typical community engagement conundrum or a public programming conundrum. What I think it's important to think about that, about exhibiting content, whether physically or otherwise, e.g. digitally. However, I would return to a point that was mentioned earlier on, which is what we call in the museum sector diversity. And it's more to do with how able have we been so far to diversify our collecting in response to the pandemic, and if we were to organize an exhibition right now, would that exhibition be you know, like construct a coherent narrative that also encompasses diverse voices and experience? From my experience at the Museum of London and the ongoing collecting project, we have done quite a great deal of it, but that's by no means conclusive. And it will never be, as Meg was saying, archival is incomplete for their very nature. But I think that because, I mean, it's you know, one of the things that we noticed from our call out in particular is that we will get, we would tend to get a similar sort of suggestions from the usual audience aspects. So, and that's an important point when we think about what stories do we tell about the pandemic in the future. And if you look at the collections that museums have of past pandemics, then you will realize that the narratives of those pandemics are very partial. And then you will realize that the objects that reflect those stories are partial and are very hegemonic, are very mainstream. So my answer to the questions about the exhibition, I would say, yes, is a great idea, but before actually showcasing a narrative, let's think carefully about the story that we're telling, and then let's see if we need to fill up some gaps in order for us to be able to tell that story.
Does anyone have anything to add to that? From the Postal Museum or the Museum of Croydon, or Elena?
If I may, one thing that we've trialled during our public call out was collecting at the point of offering an object. information about people's protected characteristics, because one key aim of the project was to centre diversity and to collect a range of voices. And as I mentioned, just as an example, we have a really strong collection of Easter cards and Christmas cards in the collection historically. But what is less represented is religious festivals from outside the Christian tradition. And I just know inside my heart that when Christmas rolls around, we're going to get an awful lot of donations of Christmas cards. And obviously that's a really important story, but we've really been trying to make ground in collecting greetings cards from other religious traditions. So we've been trying to work closely with our access and learning colleagues to use the contacts that they have. We've been working with our marketing team to make sure the messaging that we're saying about our collecting is going out to the right places in the right way to make traction. So I think that's one thing we want to continue with, is to be more purposeful in our collecting, and in order to make our historical record more useful, make it more representative. And yeah, I think obviously I think the Christmas collecting will be significant, but I think what will be most significant is the fact it's so disproportionate in terms of the numbers of objects it translates into compared to the rest of the collecting we've managed to actually make headway with this year.
I'd say for us, like, one of the things that we're really keen to take forward is things like this, really. I feel like in the past it would have been much harder to pull together a conference or an event to get people working together. There are people who I've got to know virtually since the pandemic started, who I hadn't met before within the sector, and it's been a real privilege to learn from different institutions and different places, and to really start to feel like we're pooling that knowledge and building on that together. And I think the approaches that are coming out from these kinds of discussions, I think there's quite similar threads within all the work that we're doing, and that's a really promising thing to see. I think there's so much consideration about when the right time to collect is, what the right stuff to collect is, awareness of sort of the lack of representation within our collections, and thinking, questioning ourselves on our role within that and where we haven't done things right in the past. And these are all really important and really difficult questions to consider, but I think it's great to sort of feel there's a community of people who are also sort of trying to grapple with those issues too.
It's funny that because we've still had people send things into us, even though we have distinctly told them to please not send things into us. So actually one of my colleagues is in the office today, the day before we close, actually processing a backlog of things that were just sent to us. So I think that you're always kind of going to get those unsolicited donations, unfortunately, and apparently buildings being closed don't even stop that. But I think one thing that we've tried to do as well, and this might not actually be answering your question, is build relationships with organizations that we don't really actually have a lot on at the moment, but actually play really important parts in the kind of like in the history of postal services. So for instance, the Communication Workers Union is a huge part. Unions are a huge part and have always been a huge part in kind of the postal story. So what we did early on is approach Modern Record Centre, because they're their organisational archive, checked what they were doing so we weren't duplicating any effort. And actually through that, that relationship with CUW is actually incredibly strong now. And we've got a lot of material that it was generated by Royal Mail through that relationship with CWU that we probably would have never have gotten through that. And that's just been, actually, that's one of the huge success stories, I think, of the kind of organizational collecting so far. But I think it is really just quite, it's always very hard to convince people to let go of their material, unfortunately, especially within an organizational context. And, you know, that's why I keep kind of feel like I'm repeating myself now, but that relationship building is so important, because people need to have that trust in you, that actually, especially if, you know, so like us, we hold the Royal Post Office's archive, so we're trying to get material from the National Federation of Sub Postmasters at the moment, who aren't very happy with Post Office quite a lot of the times. It's actually making sure that we stress how independent we are, and actually changing your message depending on your audience, because actually telling them that we're the official home, we give them lots of help, the Post Office lots of help in their legal queries, is not particularly what the Federation of Sub Postmasters wants to hear. So I think it's always just, you know, and I think that that's something that they don't necessarily teach you in archive school, that a lot of this work is about relationship building, and it's people skills and people management, as opposed to, you know, actually getting the stuff. Because, you know, once you've got the stuff, once it's with you, I mean, the stuff you can do, but your main obstacle problem is over because you have it. It's just getting it that's always really challenging.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Meg, and the importance of the relationship building, and also the fact that at the moment lots of what we're doing is really building those relationships and having promises in place. A lot of this is about promises to give stuff once we're at a time where we're able to accept stuff. We've got a huge backlog of stuff that we're going to have to deal with once we're at the other side of this, whatever that looks like, in terms of surveys that will have to be done physically, and boxing up trips and getting materials physically tracked. But I think at the moment it's just important to keep maintaining those relationships, even if there's only a certain point you can get up to in the transfer process. So I've been focusing quite a lot on thinking about organisations whose archives we already hold, and who we have accruals coming in from, and thinking about that procedure. So sort of rewriting our procedures for how we manage ongoing relationships with organisations, and turning that into something that's a bit more of a robust procedure, because in the past we've always sort of been firefighting with that, and so much of our work has been just going from one thing to the next, and responding to organisations or individuals reaching out to us and going on visits and getting the stuff in, and there hasn't been enough time to pause to think. And with that off-site work not being able to happen at the moment, where we're visiting organisations or individuals, it has actually given me a little bit more space to think about how we can start introducing some procedures that mean that we're thinking, okay, here's this organisation will take in more material from them in, say, 5 years' time, and how do we think about the guidance for our donors? How do we think about how we're communicating with them about what we want and what we don't want for the collections, and really just sort of doing that kind of work that is often harder to do when you're dealing with the day-to-day, and taking this moment to actually try and get those kinds of procedures in place, and think about sort of our priorities within the organisations we work with. It's involved lots of really fun going through the CALM accessions database, basically, and lots of spreadsheet work, but important sort of background work to make sure that we're maintaining those relationships and checking in with our donors to make sure that they're keeping those records, and that they're remembering that stuff still has value.
I'd just like to ask one question before we go, which I think was touched on earlier, but it'd be, you know, how do you, those who are involved in, and this is a wider question for other people as well, but obviously these projects have, you know, really impacted on the way that things are collected and what you're doing. You know, what would you say your sort of top tips, or your top tip, given our time schedule, might be for any organisations that have only just dipped their toes in the water for this type of work? What would you know, suggest was a key thing for them to take into consideration in developing their approach?
May I start? Is that okay? it's answer to your question, but also just going back to something we touched on earlier, and that was about kind of narratives of trauma and fear and balancing those with the narratives of resilience. And I would just kind of address that by saying I think they can both exist at the same time, even within one person, even within like half an hour, especially at the minute where things are changing all the time. And I think just kind of acknowledging that there's lots of things happening within just an individual, hour by hour almost, things change all the time and they are quite complicated and complex. And I would just say to question what your collecting is for. In some cases, I think a collecting call out is a marketing tool, and it's to kind of make sure that the organization's name is out there, like we're closed, but we're still doing stuff, we're still relevant. And if that's what the collecting is for, okay. But I think for us, it has been that we want really centered diverse voices and made a clear picture of what was happening at quite a deep level. And I don't think that's something we have to be doing immediately. I think it's something that we'll be collecting for decades to come. We still have offers of material from the First World War, from before the First World War, and the material we collect about those times are often the really, really personal types of material, like diaries, that I don't think people who have had complex experiences will put their hands up really quickly and say, hey, do you want my personal diary about my really traumatic experience? I think that's something people will sit with for a long time to come to make sense of their own journey through this. And just quickly, we did have a person who we've been in touch with to have an oral history interview with, and he is really, really keen that we don't do that soon. He needs time to process his experiences and he wants space from them as an individual before he tells them to us. So I think this is taking some time and having the confidence to maybe talk to people in your organisation about the reason that you haven't got an online display of material collected right now. That's kind of okay, because it is a longer term collecting project that sits within your wider collecting strategy, I think.
Thank you very much. Words of wisdom from Jo there. Anything else from Marie or Meg or Eleanor?
Yeah, I would really echo exactly those sentiments, really. And it's that not making the assumption as to what you collect now will inform necessarily what you'll be delivering later. We find it, obviously, being a local authority, we get signed up to quite a lot of projects and we'll collect this and you'll display it later. And actually there will be some quite hard questions about, is it even appropriate in a later context? Like, do we want to go back and revisit that trauma from that perspective? What the narrative will keep changing. And I thought Joanna was so right, literally on the daily, everyone changes how they're feeling about this, and actually not making that assumption is the right way to do it. And for us, it's just trying, and it's being willing to also expect sort of work through a trial and error type approach with this. Some of our projects have really worked, some of them really haven't. We've just kept them all up there just to see, because I'm sure things will just keep changing, and it's recognizing just how much everything is in flux and will continue to be. So yeah, for us it's just keeping that conversation going and just not making assumption on anyone's part in terms of how they're experiencing this at this moment in time, or recognizing that that's even how we want to talk about it in the future. We'll just keep taking it day by day.
Yeah. Thank you. Eleanor, do you have anything to
I mean, I think it's sort of all already been said very eloquently. I think yeah, something about slowing down and taking the time to sort of be kind to yourself within that. And I think sometimes remembering that everyone in this is individuals, and sort of dropping your professional veneer a bit, and being prepared to show some vulnerability within that is quite important, both through relationship building and also just thinking within the context of the team you work with, or the other people you're working with. I think within our Wellcome, we've got quite good at saying to each other when it's a bad day work, and having that flexibility of understanding that we're not working from home in a normal situation. Everyone else has their own lives and traumas and things going on. We're living through a pandemic and trying to work while we live through that experience as that's ongoing, and having the compassion to yourself and to others to sort of recognize when you can't work, and when you're putting too much pressure on yourself, I think is really important, and when topics are too difficult for you to deal with as well, like the subject matter can be hard, and you know, there have been things that I've been sent before that I've then watched, say like videos I've watched that I've sent to team members and just been like, just FYI, like if you're not feeling great right now, you probably don't want to watch this. And I think there's something in that sort of care for each other and for ourselves, but also sort of combining that with thinking slowly about things, so trying to take the pressure off.
Well, I think that brings us to slightly beyond our end time, so just a really big thank you to all of our speakers, who I think we've had a really, really interesting perspective on contemporary collecting today, and you've given me a lot to think about.